Hello everyone, today we read and comment the fourth chapter of the fourth book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. The text follows. Lost ground and want of fresh reserves are therefore usually the principal causes which determine a retreat, but at the same time we by no means exclude or desire to throw in the shade other reasons which may lie in the interdependence of parts of the army, in the general plan, etc. Every combat is therefore the bloody and destructive measuring of the strength of forces, physical and moral. Whoever at the close has the greatest amount of both is left conqueror. In the combat, the loss of moral force is the chief cause of the decision. After that is given, this loss continues to increase until it reaches its culminating point at the close of the whole act. This then is the opportunity the victor should seize to reap his harvest by the utmost possible restrictions of his enemy's forces, the real object of engaging in the combat. On the beaten side, the loss of all order and control often makes the prolongation of resistance by the individual units, by the further punishment they are certain to suffer, more injurious than useful to the whole. The spirit of the mass is broken. The original excitement about losing or winning, through which danger was forgotten, is spent, and to the majority danger now appears no longer an appeal to their courage, but rather the endurance of a cruel punishment. Thus, the instrument in the first moment of the enemy's victory is weakened and blunted, and therefore no longer fit to repay danger by danger. This period, however, passes. The moral forces of the conquered will recover by degrees, order will be restored, courage will revive, and in the majority of cases there remains only a small part of the superiority obtained, often none at all. In some cases, even although rarely, the spirit of revenge and intensified hostility may bring about an opposite result. On the other hand, whatever is gained in killed, wounded, prisoners, and guns captured can never disappear from the account. The losses in a battle consist more in killed and wounded, those after the battle more in artillery taken and prisoners. The first the conqueror shares with the conquered more or less, but the second not, and for that reason they usually only take place on one side of the conflict. At least they are considerably in excess on one side. Artillery and prisoners are therefore at all times regarded as the true trophies of victory, as well as its measure, because through these things its extent is declared beyond a doubt. Even the degree of moral superiority may be better judged of by them than by any other relation, especially in the number of killed and wounded is compared therewith. And here arises a new power, increasing the moral effects. We have said that the moral forces beaten to the ground in the battle and in the immediately succeeding movements recovered themselves gradually and often bear no traces of injury. This is the case with small divisions of the wall, less frequently with large divisions. It may, however, also be the case with the main army, but seldom of never state of or government to which army belongs. These estimate the situation more impartially and from a more elevated point of view, and recognize in the number of trophies taken by the enemy and their relation to the number of killed and wounded only too easily and well the measure of their own weakness and inefficiency. In point of fact, the lost balance of moral power must not be treated lightly, because it has no absolute value, and because it does not of necessity appear in all cases in the amount of the results at the final close. It may become of such excessive weight as to bring down everything with an irresistible force. On that account it may often become a great aim of the operations, of which we shall speak elsewhere. Here we have still to examine some of its fundamental relations. So this is the second part of the combat in general continuation, fourth chapter of the fourth book of the Vom Kriege. That I decided to cut relatively short, while we will make a larger video for the rest, right? And because actually, conceptually speaking, this video is a bit across, like the first and second part that actually could be split in this regard, but it's a bit also of a knot, right? It connects the two parts, focusing the attention, or at least, calling the attention on an important aspect that includes the culminating part of the combat in terms of the more material side of the story, and also introducing the moral effect, the moral, even could say consequences, but in terms of an eco, something that, as we have seen here, are difficult to properly objectify, do not have an absolute value, right? And this value is to be calculated and can sometimes spread over time. It can propagate, right? As for example, for the detrimental, shocking effect of a defeat in the enemy lines, in the enemy army, and so on. And we will analyze this better next time. But it's nevertheless very important to focus on these two aspects and why they happen, and why this should be taken into consideration, because there is also in here the passage that we have seen in previous chapters about what is essentially the outcome of a tactical engagement, and how this is fundamentally collected by strategy to make it effectively a strategical matter, so that there is a sort of suspense, a sort of limbo, we could say, between the two states in which a battle is fought. At one point you can't properly call it off in many ways, then the outcome follows, ensues, and there is a phase in which you still don't know basically what's happened, right? This can happen easily, not just from the defeated side, but also from the winner's side. Actually, it's kind of more evident from the win. It's more frequent from among the winners than the defeated, in many ways, for reasons that now we don't explain. I suppose von Clausewitz actually does eventually, but that's not the point in which to concentrate, and in which strategy has to make something of that outcome, right? And that will naturally dictate the same, at least in part, the same strategical decisions come from it. And this is very important because it's properly something you can't measure. Von Clausewitz here distances, you can't measure precisely. It's easier, as we've seen, to evaluate moral forces than it seems, but it is so more on the field of battle than in the headquarters, because this visual, this sensorial, this kind of intuitive dimension that is pretty spot on, humanly speaking, in understanding, what was the blow actually from a moral point of view. It's not so easy to determine, and it has to be recollected after, it has to be say understood after a while, and from some indicators that are not so immediately ready to. But this is exactly what can bring to the further expansion of the defeat. Like, this defeat can be a light one, can be a more intense one, and the absolute loss of forces on the field is not necessarily proportional to the moral effect on the field. And this dichotomy between the material dimension, that as we have seen in form of the physical annihilation of the enemy, is actually way less important overall in terms of to the moral one, at least, especially in the potential that the latter has, and more often it really has, right? And this is interesting also from a political or social point of view, because it naturally makes you understand that even small events, right, almost insignificant ones, can have enormous moral consequences, depending on other conditions that now we don't analyze, but that can equally can become properly a strategic objective, right? Sometimes it's not important even to physically destroy the enemy, but to show something that will impress the enemy, right? Think about after Cannae, right? That was a devastating defeat for the Romans. They were heavily traumatized by it, but we often misconsider, or just not consider at all, telling the truth, how devastated Hannibal was after that battle in realizing that all the plan that had brought him there to try to bring all the Italic allies of Rome from his side didn't work. And that was way more devastating than any battle of Cannae could have brought in that regard on the attack. And this moral turning points, these elements of, are properly what matter in war, more than anything else. As von Clausewitz says, the war is naturally a clash between moral forces first and foremost, and that's fundamentally what the whole objective of war is, right? The objective of war, von Clausewitz always remember, is in terms of absolute war, is not to physically destroy the enemy, which, as we have seen in the last chapters, is in the world of reality the unique way you can do it in many ways, but only by a measure. What really matters, the objective of war, is to compel the enemy to fulfill your will. That means you may not even, if you don't use violence to do that, it's not war by definition, but you can even unleash a very small amount of violence to effectively compel the enemy to fulfill your will and win the war in this way. So this is very, very important. It makes you understand how the moral dimension can make things taking off sometimes in an unprecedented way, and how do you calculate that? How to calculate a moral dimension? It's impossible, and therefore you have to be able to with your intuition, with your understanding, to make your best to understand your moral forces as well as the ones of the enemy. So von Clausewitz writes, lost ground and want of fresh reserves are therefore usually, so he's recollecting about what we read in the last video. Therefore, usually the principal causes which determine a retreat, right? So we have seen that essentially in a tactical engagement, you can properly measure moral forces by these two parameters, right? How much ground is lost but acquired, conversely, depending on which side you are, and about the state of the reserves, right? The more reserves you send in, and the less moral forces to spare you, basically, to use you practically have. And then this says generally, right? And then he writes, but at the same time, we by no means exclude or desire to throw in the shade other reasons which may lie in the interdependence of parts of the army, in the general plan, etc. Right? So these are actually, I think we read this last time as well, this trait here, but and the conclusion is every combat is therefore the bloody and destructive measuring of the strength of forces, physical and moral. Whoever at the close has the greatest amount of both left is the conqueror. Right? And this is also another important concept. I actually included on purpose this first two because they're very, they're important to start again from. They sum up basically all what we said last time at the end. This other one is very important because it basically in a tactical engagement, he who wins is the one who has destroyed, right? Properly destroyed more physical and moral forces, right? That's it. It's like a mathematical, right? If you subtract that one another, the one that goes under zero is the loser, right? And this is important because it has probably not to do with who is properly in control of the field or not, right? You may have obliged an enemy to retreat, but in there is maybe all a strategical dimension. From a strictly tactical point of view, doesn't matter. But the point, or maybe simply the enemy was defeated, but you maybe misjudged strategically the importance of that engagement. You lost too many troops, and you may actually lost something in the process, right? If you have fought to destroy the enemy forces. In this broader campaign, and you want an engagement in which, however, you basically lost more resources than the enemy did, right? And this is a simple reading because, as we have seen, as we will start seeing here, the moral dimension can flare in ways that can change a lot the outcomes of battles. And however, from a strictly tactical point of view, this is properly, in terms of objectives, what makes the outcome, right? And it's interesting that it's disconnected from the general, from the general maintenance of the position, right? One side might have even lost ground, or even being partially destroyed, but it doesn't necessarily has lost more than the other, and that absolute value matters in the end. So von Clausewitz writes, in the combat, the loss of moral force is the chief cause of the decision. Here, in terms, strictly decisional terms, this is properly what it is. You give battle because you have this superiority, this confidence. So morally speaking, you're in the condition of carrying that attack out, or giving battle in the first place. And also, what obliges you to abandon the field is how much you have lost, indeed. And von Clausewitz says, after that is given, this loss continues to increase until it reaches its culminating point at the close of the whole act. Right. So this is more generally, something actually is deeply connected with the concept of attack and defense. Here we're still in abstract terms, and naturally, von Clausewitz doesn't address the specifics of the thing. But generally speaking, who gives battle is also the one that may have more reasons even to attack the enemy proper, right? Doesn't happen all the time, right? But tactically speaking, that's what comes to happen. And if it comes to fight, he just showing up on the field and just for defending the enemy at that point, attacking him as at least feels to have more moral forces than he does, right? So that's also important to stress. But there is this culminating point of the action at the close of the whole act, right? Because we have seen that in the tactical engagements, fundamentally, reserves are a bit of a constant in warfare, right? It's extremely rare to find a combat without reserves, right? So this is something you can read over time, because troops, we have read this on the chapter about the tactical engagement, the use of reserves, of how there is probably a time dimension which that doesn't exist in strategy, for which you can even use you should actually use all your forces at once, right? When the thing descends in the field, things are different, because in there the situation is so much more devastating, for which what you need is to watch out every single step, what happens, and then decide whether to send reserves to try to control the outcome of the fight as much as you can, which is often not possible, especially considering the main object of the thing, that is to destroy the enemy, for which actually, in spite of reserves, you may actually want to engage most of your forces immediately. These balances are all very important. We'll come back on them dramatically often through the rest of the Vom Kriege, but they have to be very clear, because it's all very axiomatic and dichotomic. Then von Clausewitz says, this then is the opportunity the victor should seize to reap his harvest by the utmost possible restrictions of his enemy's forces, the real object of engaging in the combat. Right, and this is the whole thing, right? There's a culminating point after which the situation accelerates towards the, in favor of one side or the other, eventually bringing, not always, but most of the times, to a proper, in fact, the defeat of Wu is getting the worst of that, and the victory, conversely, of Wu is, taking advantage. And this is properly the point, that there is a dimension of combat in which you have to burn out the energies, you have to bear the destruction, right, even of the enemy's force, because if you want to overcome them, they will surely destroy part of your own. But there is a point at which the enemy will have fundamentally exhausted his reasons to stand on fighting, and will start to run. And that's the moment in which you actually have to exploit the situation as much as you can, because with all the risks that also exist, but that are definitely less than once during combat on a regular base, to essentially pursue the enemy and gain and carry out what is properly the greatest amount of destruction that happens, that is not during a battle, but after the battle, and for which you have been fighting in the first place, because that's your motivation. That's what, morally speaking, has brought you to fight in the first place. And von Clausewitz writes, so here we see the real object of engaging in combat in the first place, because otherwise there would be no combat, right? And he writes, on the beaten side, the loss of all order and control often makes the prolongation of resistance by individual units by the further punishment they are certain to suffer more injurious than useful to the whole, right? This is also interesting, which, if I understand correctly, refers to the fact that, of course, there is going to be always, during a retreat, some unit that resists, but at the same time, it's dangerous for forces that are somewhat still fresh, but see the possibility of not winning the battle anyway to retreat, and this also happens extremely often. So at that point, rather than just being destroyed, just flee, because maybe some of you at least will manage to survive, and not to be destroyed or captured, whatever. And von Clausewitz writes, the spirit of the mass is broken. This is the core of the thing. The whole army now is retreating. The original excitement about losing or winning, through which danger was forgotten, is spent, and to the majority danger now appears no longer an appeal to their courage, but rather the endurance of a cruel punishment. And just, this is very relatable, right? You don't have to have participated to a battle to try to, to observe what are the essential feelings that are involved in here. Like, think about when you have to do, I don't know, something even, debatable in your youth, that involves risk and possibility of a fight, or being caught where you shouldn't be, and so on, and especially in group, and you start feel this excitement, not because you think that you're gonna make it, but because you're excited by this is, which is actually the second element of the Clausewitzian Trinity, which is probably the military one, that is the one dedicated to the free spirit, to the gamble, to the idea of, let's just roll the dice and see what comes out. This thrill for the unknown, for the game, properly a game. Always remember that war is a game by definition, right? And this is quite fascinating, because it shows, by the way, that the military is not properly the bloodthirsty, the violent. It's the people that is the most radically violent fringe of every society, right? While politics is the more rational as possible. The military one is thrilled by this idea, okay, let's give battle. There can never be the certainty of winning, but let's try to work in a way it can. Let's test ourselves in this regard. Then, when things go wrong, you start feeling this sense of despair, and seeing, von Clausewitz said it multiple times, as, the outcome as, here it says, an endurance of a cruel punishment, right? As at the end here, in the idea of keeping resistant further, and therefore let's go away. We don't want to be involved. This is something you can feel if you have been through certain camaraderie of sort. You're doing kind of competitive, aggressive stuff, in group. You know what it feels like, and here. Von Clausewitz writes, thus the instrument in the first moment of the enemy's victory is weakened and blunted, right? And therefore no longer fit to repay danger by danger, right? So there is a balance that is being shifted now irreversibly, or almost, right? Or, it's always a matter of probabilities, actually, right? And we will see now that sometimes there are battles that can even be reversed, right? It often happens often. Apparently, think about, I don't know, even the Battle of Hastings, or the Anglo-Saxons had won, technically speaking. But even in there is a capacity of reprisal and counterattack and so on. So it's never sure, and that's why before we were saying that the winner has actually less awareness than the defeated sometimes. What the hell is going on in the first place? But it can vary as well. And so you give up. You can't repay now danger by danger. That is, statistically speaking, you don't want to play anymore. right? Because you know you're very likely going to lose, and too much, right? And even here you can very well understand how it's not just a matter of mere probability here, but that there is properly an emotional dimension that you can't take up. I mean, the Clausewitzian Trinity, of course, lives in every single person, right? It's not that the military doesn't have the fury of a people or the rationale of a politician, right? It just has it normally as an element of society less, right? And it's more intrigued by this game, by this competition, fundamentally. But it's always there, so if you're risking to die, that's definitely something you may not want to do most of the times. And actually, some of the best troops, are capable of surrendering in certain circumstances. May not have, in fact, much to do with whatever your beliefs are, because even the most highly intensively trained military elite can freak out and start using assault rifles as clubs right during combat, because that's what human beings do anyway, under enough stress. But that's just an example of in order to make you understand that there is also properly the despair, right? Here Von Clausewitz is talking about the system in general, right? Almost in an ideal sense, relatively to the here, as he actually pictured in previous part of the chapter, says here everything jumps, like the destruction of the moral forces passes through the destruction of the chain of command, of the cohesion of the troops. So that's what properly says, okay, we're done here, right? And you are actually very scared, because you're as close to that as you can be. Then von Clausewitz writes, this period, however, passes. The moral forces of the conquered will recover by degrees, order will be restored, courage will revive, and in the majority of cases there remains only a small part of the superiority obtained, often none at all. So what does this mean exactly? And here's, if you read the further, let's continue reading. It says, in some cases, even although rarely, the spirit of revenge and intensified hostility may bring about an opposite result. On the other hand, whatever is gained is in killed, wounded, prisoners, and guns captured can never disappear from the account. Right? So what happens in here is, of course, from both sides, and here he is starting to talk from the winner's side instead. It may well happen that all this effort was actually extremely heavy at the point you actually don't even feel like you've won anything. And this situation is very dangerous, because the enemy could actually even regroup in the same way and counterattack. This happens, right? It's at least in the moment of this fear, in this moment of vulnerability, because your forces are spent. We've seen it very well in the chapter about strategy and tactics and reserves. The point here is that even if you have taken the field, if the enemy is fled, you may not even have the forces to pursue the enemy. That's a very risky business, because you don't even know what's going on from the other side, and you may have to remain on the field for, in fact, a longer time. Think about the Middle Ages, where normally you had to stay 3 days on the field and go away to prove, in fact, you had completely won, that you had not escaped after when night came, because otherwise, we were talking about it incidentally a few weeks ago on the Battle of Toro, that this showed this exact situation, for which it was just a symbolical stand, but both armies were exhausted and feared at the point, because fundamentally there was no clarity about what the freaking hell had happened in the first place, right? That's a very good example, and I advise it to you if you want to understand this exam, the situations better. And therefore, the situation is still very fluid, right? There is just one element that cannot be altered in this sense in absolute terms. Maybe in relative terms it can, right? But it's properly the losses, as von Clausewitz puts here. killed, wounded prisoners, guns captured, right? Lots of other things. Here he's talking about guns because if you realize, a few, in the last two chapters, von Clausewitz decided to exemplify the situation from early 19th century warfare. Not that this has a universal value. This can be applied very easily to any other situation. Think about even pre gunpowder warfare. How even the banners, for example, the enemy, even greater structures. Think about the same treasure in the enemy camp, right? This is something from Clausewitz's time didn't quite exist in the same way, but that was a thing at the time. So this can actually be seen in every other. Capturing enemy tanks, for example. The tanks are generally not abandoned because they can move well on their own, but seizing, capturing enormous amounts of men and material of the enemy is an enormous deal, right? It's the same exact thing in every. Always remember, Vom Kriege is directed to all warfare, right? This is not about 19th century warfare, as many people who don't understand anything about von Clausewitz think that this is a universal language. This talks about warfare, past, present, and future. War is always like this. There's not even an element that changes in this picture, and this is what we talk about the Vom Kriege for. And these things cannot, obviously, killed people can't unfortunately be resurrected. The wounded are often out of action in the first place, and things tend to get worse in the immediate aftermath of the battle. Prisoners actually can be recaptured, right? There are many examples in which they think about Azincourt, in which Henry V allegedly put to death many French prisoners during the battle, exactly because even if they had won by that point, they still didn't know what the French were doing around. So it said, okay, as it often happened during battles, there were entire, handful of knights that could charge into the enemy ranks and recapturing troops. It happened all the time. It happened really all the time. And that's another thing. So as long here, the thing would be as long as you maintain the prisoners under your control, which in Napoleonic warfare, which is what von Clausewitz is talking about, was much less, in fact, a reversible thing after all, considering that the forces involved, generally speaking. So this all depends on the context, but the dynamic, as we were saying before, is universal. It's always the same thing in warfare forever. And same goes with guns that naturally can't be recaptured, or maybe they can't be recaptured, right? They're even not so easy to transport in the first place. But von Clausewitz is talking about here for what is definitely lost, right? And that's another, that's something that still has naturally its own importance in this tactical dimension here that he points out, because he wants to stress that those resources can't be properly used anymore. That is, even if you recover forces with troops that have even apparently lost the battle, maybe can counterattack the enemy and reverse the outcome, still, the dead are out of the game, banally speaking, but it's still important because there is still much less, and together with that loss of other things, including cohesion, order, and lots of psychophysical aspects that in the world render the thing way more difficult than before. That naturally the balance is between two realities, so it's more difficult in the sense that it's tougher to do, but it's not necessarily more or less difficult to reverse the outcome, even if that happens after all rarely in warfare. So von Clausewitz says the losses in battle consist more in killed and wounded. Those after the battle more in artillery taken and prisoners. Right, this is obvious. That is not to say that killed people are usually, here the killed people can be more, very often they are more in the pursuit than in combat. But here von Clausewitz is talking about in relative terms. That is to say, the combat is more about killing and wounding, right? thus after a battle, maybe in absolute terms the kills are even more than in combat, as it regularly happens, but the prisoners are way more, right? And artillery also here must be understood as an element of great importance from a general point of view. I mean, the artillery, we've seen that no battle could be won like just with artillery alone, right? It's obvious that the majority of the manned musketry, the cavalry, that is what makes the bulk of the arm. Artillery was almost an accompanying element. You know that artillery during Napoleonic Wars wasn't even to practically kill people, right? That was just a secondary consequence that, the better it was, but the main thing was about shattering psychologically the enemy ranks. Think about ricochet fire. It wasn't about, striking in the midst of the enemy ranks and making, literally, this body's exploding. It was about literally making the troops watching the cannonball bounce in front of their eyes for hundreds of meters so that they could shatter. In the front line, it was, as always, made up by the soldiers that are more capable of maintaining the order and the cohesion, so that all the posterior ranks would freak out. And then possibly the ball bouncing also into the enemy ranks, but it wasn't always done. But that was the objective of artillery, because even if the cannonball had hit like in the midst of the formation, it would have fallen maybe in the third or the second rank, and the guys in the first rank would have not seen their comrades literally exploding into pieces, and they would have maintained more cohesion than if they maybe had not even shot themselves, but just seen that the cannonball bouncing in front of them, running towards them, right? So that's what that thing was really about. So this is just to tell you how artillery, after all, didn't make much of the death, right? Artillery actually made less of the death. During Napoleonic warfare, the majority of deaths was caused by musketry fire, cavalry, right? Artillery was the last, very last, but it kind of had this major psychological impact. It used to shatter the enemy in this sense. And that tells you the importance of the psychological factors over an arm that, by definition, killed less than all the others. And that yet costed, in fact, a freaking lot, right? So logistically speaking, what's the price of taking artillery? It's not just a nominal thing. It's literally that in order to produce artillery, a state had to pay an enormous lot of money for casting the cannons, for producing the ammo, for bringing it to the field. Enormous costs. So once you took that, not only you basically took the cannon away, but you basically took away all the cost that had the enemy had spent to produce it. So it's an enormous deal, and that's why it becomes so important, practically speaking. So for the rest, the prisoners are obvious, right? That other people simply surrender. They're exhausted. It happens quite easily. Then there would be other considerations about the reserves, especially cavalry ones, to the pursuit and so on. But it's obvious what here the general thing of how prisoners are taken. Here from Clausewitz says the first the conqueror shares with the conquered, right? The killed and wounded in combat are generally the same, right? Especially in these cases where there were European armies that were identical to each other, so they fought with the same tactics, the same way. Of course, leadership, equipment, morale, all things could vary, but generally speaking, it could happen even that the thing could swing so that even the winner actually suffered more losses than the defeated in combat proper. But still, the forces are comparable, and the larger the losses are comparable, and the larger the units are, as we have seen, and the more the thing becomes homogeneous. That is, it's much easier to have a let's say unbalanced tactical outcome in terms of let's say tactical combat in terms of losses than a strategic one, right? So the thing flattens. The more you rise up through the ranks, let's say the scale of the engagement in this regard. So, in fact, Von Clausewitz says, the first conqueror shares with the conquered more or less, right? But substantially in the same way, but the second not. Because, of course, the victor here is killing, often way more people is killed during a pursuit that is killed in combat, and all this other stuff, prisoners, artillery, and so on. And von Clausewitz says, and for that reason, they usually only take place on one side of the conflict, at least. They are considerably in excess on one side. So this is obvious, like it's very difficult. I mean, it's not very difficult, but it's less frequent, naturally, to find a battle in which the outcome is like more or less difficult to determine, in which the two sides have suffered the same amount of losses. But it does happen indeed, right? And it can't be like the battle is being fought so ferociously that after all, the winner didn't have enough forces to spend to overwhelm the enemy on the retreat. I mean, it depends, right? It can happen. It's not frequent, but it happens. Then von Clausewitz writes, artillery and prisoners are therefore at all times regarded as the true trophies of victory, as well as its measure, because through these things its extent is declared beyond a doubt. Right? So the amount of prisoners and this other trophies, including artillery in Napoleonic times, other banners during the Middle Ages, the enemy camp, indeed, the treasure, right, the royal banner, the carroccio, all these stuff, were properly quantifying the outcome, right, the measure of victory, specifically speaking. And von Clausewitz says, there is no doubt that objectively they are, right, because as, the more they are, of course, the more they show that the enemy is being wiped out in this thing, that there's not much that has been saved after all, and that properly what the combat had been carried out for brought to harvest this result, right? So paradoxically speaking, what is important in the battle is not even, for the tactical and eventually, I mean, not for the tactical, but probably for the fact how this transitions into the strategical reality. We didn't stress that before enough when von Clausewitz says, that forces are gradually regained. So there is an awareness of what, these forces can be reemployed like, tactically speaking. There is always a strategical dimension. It's not that, the battle is devoid of strategic elements in it, and vice versa, right? But properly, what you fought for is for inflicting these losses to the enemy. There are mostly losses that happen after the battle. So paradoxically, combat in battle is not even the most important thing at the end of the day, in terms of what did you fight that for. Conversely, because of the exceptions we were talking about before, of course, there can be a combat that is dramatically important because it actually wipes out maybe a great part of not only of the enemy forces but of your own forces, and that also has an important strategical consequence as well. And as we've seen, generally speaking, what do you fight for if you have, for example, lost more than the enemy? Right? You may have thrown it out of the field, but generally speaking, in strategical terms, you have been defeated. And von Clausewitz writes, even the degree of moral superiority may be better judged of by them than by any other relation, especially if the number of killed and wounded is compared therewith. And here arises a new power increasing the moral effects. Right? So he stresses this fact that largely what happens after the combat, so aside from the dead and wounded, is morally more impacting, paradoxically, in fact, than the combat itself. And von Clausewitz starts introducing this aspect of the moral effects that is, sees the rise properly of a new power. Von Clausewitz says, we have said that the moral forces beaten to the ground in the battle and in the immediately succeeding movements recover themselves gradually. So here is that transition phase between tactics and strategy, in which the forces are disrupted after the battle, that can't be even won, as we've seen, but gradually they regain cohesion, strength, order, that they find their commanders, that they're reformed, and so on. So probably at that point they're ready to be spent again, because the combat is over, so the tactical dimension is being abandoned, and there is once again a strategical thing that is to eventually bring to fight another battle, tactically. And often bear no traces of injury. This is interesting, right? Because it already stresses the fact that even in a defeat, there is a moment in which, think about the prisoners, that many of them, they can be exhausted, whatever, but they, if they were not captured, they could maybe, recover after some time easily and to be put in line once again, right? So there are situations in which there are troops that flee and then eventually manage to regroup and reform, and they're kind of fine once again, right? With all, the circumstance of the case. And von Clausewitz says, this is the case with small divisions of the wall, less frequently with large divisions, right? That is to say, it's obvious, this is very important, this is, it shows how properly the most devastating, the greatest devastations of combat and its outcome happen on a larger scale, right? What does this mean practically? That obviously it's easier to find a company in a retreat, just maybe not even fought, right? But being part of a division that is being ravaged, right? Of which many companies are being literally wiped out. So this is the point that he's making. That is not to confuse the fact that tactical engagements are heavier, by themselves, by than what eventually, the general, the larger strategical outcome wouldn't show, right? The larger strategical outcome shows this gigantic forces to smash against each other, sometimes literally wiping out entire army corpses, and this means that tactically speaking, entire units are being literally wiped out that do not exist consistent physically anymore, so never confuse here, never think that it's easy, that you can guide war from the little tactical engagement. War is about this enormous amount of forces. We've seen in previous chapters how that's effectively what you really want to happen if you want the war to end in your favor, right? The more you want that, the more the thing is going to be dramatic in many ways, because you're not sparing yourself in that regard. For Clausewitz writes, it may, however, also be the case with the main army, but seldom or never in the state of government to which the army belongs. So what does this mean? Is that also that strategically this may be true, but politically not, right? So that, of course, an entire army could be wiped out, but the state that used it is most of the time still there. Always naturally realize what we're talking about. War is nothing, obviously, but a persecution of politics by other means. So there is a moment in which tactics transitions into strategy, and strategy eventually transitions into policy, because there is properly the general-in-chief that is entrusted, is given a military mandate by the state, that is the one that always decides what the hell is going on, whether you can keep fighting or not, and that therefore there is not an unleashed military dimension that doesn't take into account what the state says, right? There's not a moment in which a general receives the mandate and say, okay, well, I can do whatever I want. It never happens. We have seen it quite clearly that politics is always there to take away everything from a moment to another if they just want. Always, all the time. It properly never ceases, right? There's not a separation. Why? Because war has a cost, and that is to be paid politically, socially, and that's probably the most important thing of how, not probably properly, right? What determines the outcomes of a war, because you have literally, we repeated before, the objective of war is simply to compel the enemy to fulfill your will, that is to compel a state to do what you state want, right? So that's basically it. What's happening in the clash in the military dimension, it can come to an end at any moment, right? most brutal example, I don't know, the Vietnam War was called it off. It's not that the Americans weren't technically winning on the field. The same goes with many arguments to kill Jerry. And I like to point out usually these examples to make you understand how important that is. How that there is not probably a war that can't be won, because it's not a military technical problem why it can't be won. It's simply a political and social problem why it can't be won. Ask the French in Algeria. They were literally winning on the field. Were kicking ass. Simply, the war was stopped because they wanted to avoid justly another revolution in France, which actually risked it for real. So that's a very important aspect of the situation, and it is probably the single most important thing you have to think in every single historical context you can imagine, because this is telling truth. Most of what the greatest changes of history of humanity have passed through, right? And the Clausewitzian trinity of politics, war, and society is not to be given just as an idea. It's not a matter of personal opinion whether you like it or not. Then von Clausewitz writes, these estimate the situation more impartially and from a more elevated point of view, and recognize in the number of trophies taken by the enemy and their relation to the number of killed and wounded only too easily and well the measure of their own weakness and inefficiency. That is to say that for a general in a headquarters that doesn't see what concretely happened on the field, like the trophies of prisoners and guns, let's say, are more objectively and impartially important to make a strategic assessment than even the number of the killed and the wounded. Obviously enough, right? It's a pretty good indicator that there is not, it sounds even banal, but objectively, how many times in your life before listening to this or having read the Vom Kriege, in fact, did you conceptualize that? Right, this is very important. I make these videos for a broader, let's say, political, social awareness. But if you're a military historian, you gotta be concrete about this stuff, right? You can't, I admit, not even myself had ever completely, like, it's obvious that if I saw, major trophy capture, say, well, wow, this was a crashing victory in many ways. Once again, the Battle of Toro that comes into my mind, it was about the royal banner, for example, being lost and being reconquered, and that already tells you that something happened on the field. It was not a crashing victory from the eventually what was the winner's side, right? So that's exactly the point we're making here, that we can evaluate by statistics. It's not always the same, but even in here, it's a matter of probability, right? And there is a way to be reasonably sure, not certain, but okay, I accept it as historical data, right? It tells me that quite likely this was the situation. It's very important, as a matter of fact. And also, this measures in turn the weakness and efficiency of the same enemy, because it's not that you get defeated just. And this is interesting, you see, because it's not about the saying how hard you fought. That can tell how organized you are or you are not. But what's the devastation that is created afterwards, after the defeat, that tells you that, yeah, someone is being surely brave to have himself killed in combat, but look at the quality of the army in itself. That can be measured profitably exactly through the amount of these indicators, that the size of the indicators that tell you that there was something crashing properly about this victory, that may have arrived, by the way, by also the ability of the winner, but that rarely is rarely a devastating defeat comes with no mistakes. Right, this is also very important to stress. Mistakes or faults in general of an army, because as we have seen in real war, especially the greater the engagements are, the more the odds are even. So for such an outcome, you must explain that in a way that takes into consideration the actual loss that is not is an absolute thing, and is measured in part, however, by, as we have seen, like in tactically speaking, by the number of ground lost or gained, or the employer reserve, strategically by these trophies, right? Guns, other important means, or prisoners, and they cannot be faked. They cannot say, okay, but that doesn't really count after all, because, I don't know, the troops fought bravely. Yes, but the army's been destroyed. And the larger this engagement was, and the more you have to explain why it happened, because statistically as well, the larger the engagement is, and the more the forces are even. So someone either did a major mistake, or this army wasn't as great or capable as it was seen. So there is an enormous deal to explain in that regard. There are major macroscopical historiographical chapters, military history, that deal exactly with this, right? You know, some of the greatest defeats in the history of mankind have changed history forever, are generally the failure of not just of a military system, but generally speaking of a political military system and social system, right? It's very easy to blame people. You know, that's the idiocy of, you know, our youth, and, you know, our generations actually, that has grown of, you know, a keyboard lions and the internet, thinking that, I don't know, countries win or lose wars because their people or individual soldiers are more or less courageous. Courage is literally one of the cheapest moral resources you can find anywhere in the world, in every people, in the same way, right? Human courage is boundless. You know, you can't say, you know, there's a people that is more combative or more warlike than it. It doesn't mean anything. Wars are fought through reason, discipline, organization, something that you must have a hell of a political and social system to develop. Whether a soldier is courageous on the field or not, it's literally one of the least important thing in the world history of warfare and of humanity in the first place, because, once again, courage is literally one of the cheapest moral qualities, and it's not even by itself one of the most important moral elements in warfare, right? You need even a specific type of courage in order to make it you know, fruitful in military terms. So I suppose, to me, this thing sounds extremely banal, but I can see constantly, you know, this kind of silly YouTube content, like saying, you know, dealing with countries or nationalities, but talking about warfare, that, you know, as if, you know, there was a football game in which a people was braver than another, and that's what made it. That just reflects the the complete absence of historical education from that side. But once again, these are people that we count in the hundreds of millions. They will become the next you know, working class, next ruling class, and that's how they reason. Just think in which situation we are, in which bright future of open-minded and enlightened people we're thrown in, right? And this is disgusting, because it happens literally in every single country. Like, you can't even say, you know, that country doesn't do that. No. In our mass societies, the overwhelming majority of the people is completely incompetent and worthless in terms of a positive qualitative improvement of civilization, and we have to be extremely honest about that. It's extremely cheap to be courageous. It's extremely cheap to be resilient. Right? It's not cheap for the people that invest resources in that, but it's something extremely easy to do. Right? It doesn't require great intelligence, great competence, great spirit, great, you know, every brainless thug can achieve that, and that's how we rightfully exploit them, just also in a socio-economical sense. Fortunately so, because this allows, you know, the more gifted people to be in charge of a situation, as it's always been by tendency, historically speaking. And and don't bring on the populist thing that the political class is just about stupid people, because if the political class is about stupid people, you can be sure that society is more stupid than that. and that therefore they should even be thankful that they have that level of intellective development in the elites. But just under sarcastic, but I think pretty spot on and realistic assessment on the society we think to be so advanced, and it's not advanced at all, like in terms of individual quality that has been brought at the center of every advertisement, like everything revolves around you, that you're special, that your opinions matter, that you're important, that you will be successful. Guess what? Nobody gives a damn about you, and why should they, right? It's normal to be mediocre. It's normal to be basically insignificant in front of the rest, right? The world definitely does not revolve around you, but if anything, not only you revolve around the world, but you also revolve around the world with lots of other people, right? So that's what you should be aware. The world most definitely does not and will not, thankfully, revolve around you, right? And if you develop mental delusions because of that, don't blame the world, because that's always been the same. If anything, there's something wrong in you that quite likely has been wrong since the very beginning, and that's the root of all evils, actually. Our dramatic lack of scholarization, even in the most advanced Western society, the sheer intellectual inexistence of entire chunks of the population, right? And that's a serious problem. We can't afford anymore, right? We're already paying for this, systematically speaking. This costs an enormous lot. People's stupidity costs money, a lot of money. Your money, the ones you have in bank or in your wallet, are stolen continuously by stupidity, lack of education, ignorance, and incapacity to wrap a mind around some of the most simple things you should have been learning in school at some point. That most adults don't even know what they are. In order to finish this, then eventually we will complete the next time the longer text. But Vom Clausewitz says, in point of fact, the lost balance of moral power must not be treated lightly because it has no absolute value, right? And because it does not of necessity appear in all cases in the amount of results at the final close, right? So this is very important, as we have seen at the beginning of the video, because moral forces are not immediately quantifiable, and especially the outcome of combat can develop certain moral forces that may not effectively correspond to the rational loss of the whole thing, and that may have, however, as we've seen, that moral forces are the most important factor in warfare, actually coming to concur to your own defeat, simply because your morale is brought down dramatically. And Von Clausewitz says here we cannot pretend that it's not a problem, because there is no absolute value to it, so it can't brutally swing. It does brutally swing. You can't properly measure it easily, and especially after the battle. So in the moment in which you should technically be in the emergency, more aware of what is going on, in which the enemy, as we have seen, is taking dramatically advantage of your disorder, of your moral disorder, and seizing trophies and all those things that matter eventually from a strategical point of view. You don't know what it's like. You can't see it. And that's why, in fact, there are countless military historical examples of, the greatness even of those moral figures that were able to stand even after a defeat, and understanding the necessity of attacking now, passing dramatically on defensive, not leaving the enemy like simply sweeping through your land. I'm still thinking about Cannae and Scipio, that was one of the few after the defeat to say, we should press on, we should take away the granaries from the Carthaginians, we should immediately regain the initiative, because that's what limits this, right? The thing about the initiative, we haven't touched it completely, but we will have to eventually. That's losing the initiative, simply letting the initiative to the enemy is one of the most detrimental things you can ever possibly even imagine to do. And that is true in every single matter in life. You should always work constantly. You should always give your best. Never give up in any way. Continue fighting, because if you are brought down by defeat, the worst thing you can do is to linger on that, to keep on being kept under by that. And you understand this is a very psychological way of talking, and that is not often easy. You can't say to a depressed person, cheer up, because that's literally the worst thing you can say to a depressed person, but that's an illness, at least a pathology, a very serious one. But in terms of mood, generally speaking, you can even bring yourself into depression at some point as a triggering factors of major failures or losses and so on that are exactly about this, that you shouldn't second the negative aspects of your minds, of your behavior, as much as you can, because you have control on that up to a certain point. There's a point you will not have control on it anymore. That's when it becomes pathological, and the same goes in many ways in war as well. You must do something. You must keep your act together and go on, right? As much as you can, even if it's going bad, but at least you will come out of that as slightly better than if you just let the initiative to the enemy. And in fact, von Clausewitz says it may why should we care about the balance of moral power? Because it does not of necessity appear in all cases in the amount of the results of the final clause, as we've seen, but it may become of such excessive weight as to bring down everything with an irresistible force. This is the problem, right? Maybe the engagement was not even such a big deal. Yeah, you were defeated, but come on. But what can spread from that, from a moral point of view, is potentially enormous. And it can come to arrive as an irresistible force. So you should stem it since the beginning. It's like a breach in a dam, right? You don't want it to enlarge. It's exactly the same thing. It's not that the damage is not there, that you shouldn't do something about it, or that it's easy, right? But the more you let it open, and the more at some point you will get overwhelmed, right? It will cost you more. It's exactly the same thing. And von Clausewitz writes, on that account, it may often become a great aim of the operations of which we shall speak elsewhere. Here we have still to examine some of its fundamental relations, and that's where I decided to stop for today, because eventually there is a thorough explanation of the whole thing in a long text, and we'll see it next time, hopefully. So I would say stop it here for now, and I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.